morning air inside Logan International Airport was crisp, almost clinical, the kind that filled your lungs with the sterile bite of recycled ventilation. At Gate B29, time moved differently. Not slow, not fast, just heavy, like the weight of too many unspoken things pressing against the glass walls overlooking the runway. Malik Carrington sat quietly near the window, a leather briefcase at his feet, and a battered paperback open in his hands. He wasn't scrolling through his phone like most of the other travelers. He wasn't tapping his foot anxiously, wasn't signed to delay announcements buzzing over the loudspeakers. He simply read, his posture straight but relaxed, his breathing slow, his presence understated yet unmistakable. He was, in every sense, the picture of calm, and somehow that calm unsettled the world around him. At 61, Malik carried the kind of quiet dignity that only comes from decades of navigating spaces that weren't built for men like him. His dark gray overcoat, crisp dress slacks, and well-worn leather shoes spoke not of opulence but of intentionality, a man who knew the value of being prepared for any room he might have to enter. His salt and pepper beard was trimmed with military precision, framing a face that could, if you looked closely enough, tell 1,000 stories without uttering a single word. His ticket to New York City rested neatly in the breast pocket of his coat, visible yet unobtrusive. His only movement, aside from the occasional turning of a page, was the soft underlining of passages in his book, a thick legal text on international human rights precedents. A blue-inked pen danced methodically across the lines, marking thoughts only he could trace. Around him, the terminal buzz of the low hum of modern impatience. Rolling luggage wheels, barista shout-outs for half-sieve lattes, the tinny ring of boarding calls. Families herded their children toward gates. Businessmen barked into Bluetooth headsets. College students collapsed against their backpacks, earbuds firmly sealing them off from the world. But Malik didn't need noise-canceling headphones. His silence was its own kind of armor. Still, in a world that often mistook black stillness for threat, armor wasn't always enough. Across the waiting area, perched near the priority boarding desk, Lydia Whitmore noticed him. Mid-50s, draped in a silk scarf and clutching a designer tote, Lydia had cultivated the particular skill set of people who believe the world revolves around their comfort. She knew the first-class wine list better than most flight attendants. She corrected minor inconveniences with a tone that brooked no discussion. And she noticed when someone didn't fit the rhythm of the space she considered hers. Malik's silence drew her gaze like a magnet she didn't know she was carrying. Something about him, the way he wasn't performing the casual busyness of travel, the way he sat composed and unaffected, prickled at her. A discomfort she couldn't name wormed its way into her chest, tightening her grip on her bag. She watched as he turned another page, uncaring of her stare. Her husband, George, oblivious beside her, tapped away at his phone, searching for stock updates or golf scores or some other triviality. But Lydia leaned forward slightly, scanning Malik with a trained suspicion of someone taught. Subtly but thoroughly, that difference was danger. She frowned. Too still, too detached, too calm. It didn't matter that he was doing nothing wrong. It didn't matter that his boarding pass poked visibly from his coat pocket, or that his ID had already been checked at security like every other passenger. What mattered was how he made her feel, unsettled, uncertain. And in her world, those feelings justified action. Lydia rose, smoothing the front of her cashmere sweater, and crossed to the gate agent, a young woman barely out of college, typing distractedly at her podium. "Excuse me," Lydia whispered, voice honey but urgent. "That man by the window, the one in the gray coat, something's not right." The agent blinked up at her, startled. "Ma'am, he's just waiting to board like everyone else." He cleared security. "I know what I saw," Lydia insisted, her voice sharpening. "He's been sitting there watching people. Too quiet, too calculated. I travel enough to know when something feels wrong." The agent hesitated, glancing toward Malik. He didn't look suspicious. He looked like he belonged in a courtroom or a university lecture hall, not on any threat list. Still, airport policy was clear. When in doubt, report. The agent reached for the radio. Lydia returned to her seat, feeling a small, righteous relief bloom in her chest. She hadn't accused him of anything specific. She hadn't needed to. A simple whisper would be enough. It always was. Back by the window, Malik turned another page, oblivious of the chain reaction now rippling toward him. At that exact moment, across the concourse near security post, Deputy Officer Carter Briggs's radio crackled to life. Suspicious passenger reported at gate B29. Male, mid-60s. Possible surveillance behavior. No visible threat at this time. Advise approach. Carter cracked his knuckles, the habitual gesture of a man who loved the idea of quick action. He nudged his partner, Officer Stephen Marsh, a man 20 years older, slower, more methodical, but no less willing to follow protocol when gut instinct was invoked. Got one, Carter said, already moving. He didn't ask for a description beyond mid-60s, male. Didn't check the boarding list. Didn't request security footage. Why would he? Instinct didn't need confirmation. It only needed a target. And Malik Carrington had just been marked. The distance between the officers and gate B29 was short, but every step thudded with the heavy inevitability of misunderstanding sharpening into something more dangerous. Malik caught the movement out of the corner of his eye. Two officers, veering off the main walkway, cutting to the rows of travelers, zeroing in on him with that tight, predatory focus he had learned to recognize too many lifetimes ago. He didn't tense. He didn't run. He closed his book calmly, slipped his pen into his coat pocket, and rose to his feet with deliberate grace. The world around him seemed to slow, the ambient noise of the airport dimming into something hollow and sharp-edged. Malik Carrington stood still at airport gate B29, unarmed, unmoved, and, despite everything, unafraid. And somewhere deep in the marrow of that silence, history was already starting to shift. For a moment, there was nothing but the soft mechanical murmur of the terminal. Beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows at Logan Airport, the runway stretched into a misty horizon, blurred by the morning drizzle. Planes taxied in solemn procession. Overhead, the PA system buzzed with boarding calls. Coffee orders were shouted across kiosks, and the steady rumble of restless travelers blended into a familiar airport symphony. But at gate B29, Lydia Whitmore wasn't listening to any of it. Her eyes were fixed on Malik Carrington. She sat rigid in her seat, her designer tote perched stiffly on her lap, her fingers anxiously twisting the strap. Every so often, she stole glances at him, quick, assessing, fearful. To anyone else, Malik was just another passenger, a black man quietly minding his business. But to Lydia, the silence wrapped around him felt menacing. He was too composed, too still, too detached. It wasn't logical. Lydia knew that. It wasn't even tangible. But in a world that taught people like her to trust their gut feelings without interrogation, suspicion required no evidence, only instinct. And her instinct told her this man didn't belong. The narrative unfolded inside her mind without her even realizing it. Someone sitting so still must be hiding something. Someone not scrolling their phone must be watching. Someone that calm must be calculating. She didn't think about why these thoughts came so easily. She didn't question what had shaped them. She just knew she felt unsafe. Across from her, George, her husband, barely glanced up from his phone. Stocks were rising. The Red Sox had won last night. His world was orderly, familiar, undisturbed. He didn't see Malik Carrington as a disruption because George's world had rarely ever been disrupted by men who looked like him. But Lydia's world, built on routines, certainties, comfort zones, felt suddenly breached. Her breath hitched in her chest. The longer she watched Malik, the more her unease metastasized into something heavier. Fear. And fear, Lydia knew, demanded action. Clutching her tote tighter, she stood up and smoothed down the front of her ivory sweater. Her steps toward the gate desk were short, brisk, deliberate. The gait of someone who had made up their mind long before they were asked to justify it. The young gate agent, a woman barely older than Lydia's youngest daughter, looked up with a polite, practiced smile. "Good morning, ma'am. How can I help you?" Lydia leaned in slightly, lowering her voice to a confidential murmur. "There's a man over there by the window," she said, nodding subtly in Malik's direction. "Gray coat, dark pants. He's been watching people. It's unsettling. The agent blinked, confused. "He's just sitting there, ma'am. Reading." "No," Lydia shook her head firmly. "It's more than that. He's been sitting too still, watching too much. It's suspicious. You need to call someone." The agent hesitated. She followed Lydia's gaze to Malik, who was now closing his book and slipping it neatly into his briefcase. He didn't look suspicious. He looked dignified, focused, unbothered. But Lydia pressed on, her voice sharpening. "I travel all the time. I know it feels wrong. Please, before it's too late." The phrase landed like a dart. Before it's too late. The agent's training kicked in. The part about see something, say something. She wasn't supposed to dismiss concerns, no matter how vague. She wasn't supposed to take chances. Even if her gut said the woman was overreacting. Even if her gut said the man had done nothing but breathe. The agent picked up the radio with a sigh and pressed the call button. "Security to gate B29. Possible suspicious passenger. Male mid-60s. No visible threat yet. Standing by." The message zipped through unseen channels, leaving behind a stain that would spread faster than anyone in that terminal could predict. Lydia stepped back, a sense of righteous accomplishment settling over her. She hadn't caused a scene. She hadn't raised her voice. She had simply reported a feeling. That's all she needed to do. She returned to her seat, smoothing her skirt and casting one last glance at Malik. He was standing now, stretching slightly, completely unaware that an invisible target had been painted on his back. Lydia exhaled a shaky breath and told herself she had done the right thing. But deep down, somewhere she refused to look, a cold knot of guilt had already started to form. Near the security checkpoint, Deputy Officer Carter Briggs's radio crackled to life. "Suspicious male at gate B29. Mid-60s. Possibly casing passengers. No direct threat. Proceed with caution." Briggs grinned, snapping his gum between his teeth. Finally, some action. He turned to Officer Stephen Marsh, who nodded wearily and fell into step beside him. They didn't ask for clarification. They didn't request surveillance footage. They didn't pull up the flight manifest. They didn't need to. In Carter Briggs's mind, a suspicious black man at an airport gate was all the confirmation he required. As the two officers made their way toward B29, Marsh spoke low. "Could be nothing, just someone waiting." Briggs shrugged, a smirk tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Better safe than sorry." They cut across the terminal, weaving between travelers, their presence sharp and heavy, like thunderclouds rolling over an open field. At gate B29, Malik zipped up his briefcase, unaware of the storm now converging on him. The air seemed to change, thickening with the scent of anticipation and danger. Parents tightened their grips on their children's hands. Bystanders turned their heads, sensing tension they couldn't yet name. And Lydia Whitmore sat straighter in her seat, watching as two officers closed in on the black man she had whispered into suspicion. Somewhere deep inside her, she expected him to run. She needed him to run. But Malik Carrington simply stood still, calm as a stone in a riverbed. And that stillness, more than anything, was what the system had never learned how to handle. Not rage, not resistance, not even fear, but a black man standing tall at an airport gate, daring to exist without apology. That was the threat they had come to contain. And they were already too late. The moment Carter Briggs's boots hit the polished tile floor of the main concourse, the air seemed to shift. It wasn't just a uniform, though that played its part. The navy blue shirt, the clipped radio on his belt, the gleaming badge catching the sterile overhead lights. It was the way he moved, fast, sharp, with a kind of practice swagger that announced the world he expected compliance without question. Deputy Officer Carter Briggs didn't waste time second-guessing. He prided himself on his instincts, on reading a situation, before others even noticed there was one. And right now, his instincts told him everything he needed to know. Suspicious black man. Airport gate. No visible threat yet. That was enough. Beside him, Officer Stephen Marsh followed at a slower pace, a permanent frown creasing his weathered face. Marsh was older, closer to retirement than promotion, but years of service had taught him one unspoken rule. You don't second-guess your partner in public. Not unless you want the whole system to turn on you too. Still, even Marsh's got twisted a little as they closed the distance to gate B29. Passengers shifted aside at their approach. Mothers pulled children closer. A businessman lowered his phone, curiosity flickering across his face. A college student angled her camera subtly, already recording. The tension was tangible, clinging to the air like humidity before a thunderstorm. And at the center of it all, still calm, unyielding, stood Malik Carrington. He saw them coming. He didn't flinch. He didn't sit down. He simply straightened his coat, squared his shoulders, and waited. Something in that quiet defiance irritated Carter Briggs in a way he couldn't explain. Couldn't even admit to himself. He barked out the first words the moment he was within reach. "Sir," he said, voice clipped official. "Step away from the boarding line. We need to speak with you." Malik tilted his head slightly, studying the officer with a cool, measured gaze. "About what?" he asked, his voice even controlled. "We've received a complaint," Officer Marsh added, voice rougher, almost apologetic. "Passengers have reported you acting suspiciously." The accusation hung in the air like smoke, thick, choking, baseless. Malik blinked once, slowly. "And what behavior," he asked calmly, "is considered suspicious at an airport gate? Reading quietly, waiting for a delayed flight?" Briggs's jaw tightened. He didn't like the tone. He didn't like the way this black man at an airport gate, was standing there unafraid, unbowed. It didn't fit the story forming in his mind, the story he needed to justify what he was about to do. "Sir," Briggs said, stepping closer, "we need you to step out of line and let us inspect your belongings." Passengers were watching now. Phones were rising, recording in silent witness. Malik Carrington didn't move right away. He let the moment stretch, deliberate and razor-sharp. "My name is Malik Carrington," he said at last, voice carrying just enough to be heard by those nearest. "I am a legal advisor to the International Human Rights Tribunal. I have cleared every required security checkpoint. I am in possession of my valid boarding pass and ID. What exactly do you suspect me of?" The question landed like a slap. Briggs ignored it. He reached for Malik's briefcase without warning. Malik's hand shifted slightly, not to resist, but to hold it closer to his side. "I would appreciate it," Malik said, voice still steady, "if you provided your badge number and the specific statute under which you are detaining me." Badge numbers. Statutes. Rights. The word set Briggs's teeth on edge. This was supposed to be simple. Move the problem. Clear the discomfort. Satisfy the whisper. Keep the system running smoothly. But Malik Carrington wasn't playing the role assigned to him. He wasn't pleading. He wasn't panicking. He was standing in his knowledge, standing in his truth, and Carter Briggs hated it. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," Briggs said, stepping so close that Malik could feel the heat of his breath. "You're making it harder than it needs to be." "There's only one lawful way," Malik replied, low and firm. A heartbeat of silence. Then, click. The sharp, metallic sound of handcuffs locking around Malik's wrists shattered whatever illusions of order remained. Gasps rippled across gate B29. A woman clutched her purse tighter. A teenage boy dropped his soda. A man muttered under his breath, but didn't intervene. Because this was how it always went, wasn't it? A black man stands still at an airport gate. A whisper turns into suspicion. Suspicion turns into escalation. And escalation turns into handcuffs, without cause, without apology, without thought. Malik didn't resist. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stared ahead, his back straight, his dignity intact, even as the cuffs bit into his skin. Briggs gripped his arm harder than necessary as he led Malik away from the gate area. Passengers parted like water, some recording, some averting their eyes. Stephen Marsh followed behind, his stomach churning. He knew. God, he knew this was wrong. He had known it from the moment the radio call crackled in. But momentum was a dangerous thing. Once you start down a path paved with assumption, it's hard to turn back, especially when the world is watching. As they passed the coffee stand, Malik caught his reflection in the glass. A black man, handcuffed, silent, And in that instant, he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. This was about every time silence had been mistaken for guilt, every time dignity had been mistaken for defiance, every time skin color had been mistaken for threat. Malik closed his eyes briefly, centering himself. He wouldn't shout. He wouldn't beg. He would stand in the truth of who he was. And he would make sure the world saw it, even if they didn't understand it yet. Especially because they didn't understand it yet. And far across the terminal, Lydia Whitmore sipped her overpriced coffee, glancing at her phone, blissfully unaware that the storm she had unleashed would soon turn in a direction she never anticipated. For a moment, time froze. The handcuffs had already clicked into place, cool steel biting into Malik Carrington's wrists. But the sound, that tiny, brutal punctuation, still echoed across the terminal, louder than any boarding call, more final than any plane door slamming shut. People turned, not all at once, not in a dramatic cinematic wave, but in slow, flickering pieces, heads swiveling, eyes widening, jaws tightening. Because the truth was, they'd all heard it. The metallic snap, the shift in tone, the sound of power being exercised but not justified. At gate B29, something was unraveling. Malik stood motionless, his hands restrained behind him, shoulders squared as if he were still lecturing a hall of judges in Geneva, not standing in humiliation before an airport crowd. His expression didn't flinch, but his silence shifted. No longer passive, no longer composed. Now, it carried the weight of accusation. Deputy Officer Carter Briggs tightened his grip a little too hard, as if trying to reassert dominance. Officer Marsh lingered behind, his face drained of color, the line between duty and doubt written across every creased feature. "Let's go," Briggs muttered, already pulling Malik away from the boarding line. Malik didn't resist, but every step he took carried the weight of a quiet storm, gathering force, gathering witnesses. Near the counter, a young woman paused mid-text, lifting her phone toward the unfolding scene. She didn't know who the man was. She didn't know why he was being arrested, but something didn't sit right. He didn't look dangerous. He looked deliberate, like he'd expected this, like he'd faced this before. From 2 rows behind, a teenage boy whispered to his father, "What did he do?" "I don't know," the father said, staring. "Nothing, maybe." The mother beside them pulled their toddler closer to her lap, not out of fear of Malik, but the tension clawing its way through the terminal. Something was wrong, and everyone could feel it now, even the ones who didn't want to. Lydia Whitmore, sitting prim and satisfied, allowed herself a small sip of her cappuccino. She didn't smile. That would be inappropriate. But there was a sense of vindication curling through her chest like steam. Action had been taken. Order restored. The man who'd unsettled her, without a word, was being removed. That was all she'd wanted. Distance. Separation. Control. She didn't care where he was taken, so long as it was away from her. What she didn't see, what she didn't care to look at, with the camera phones now recording from multiple angles. What she didn't notice was a subtle shift in energy, the way sympathy had begun to gather not around her fear, but around his silence. And what she could never have predicted was what happened next. 10 feet away, the gate agent stood frozen behind her desk, her hand hovering just above the paging button. She hadn't expected this to escalate. Not like this. The man had a boarding pass, a cleared TSA scan, an ID that looked more official than anything she'd ever handled. But now he was in cuffs, and the look on his face wasn't panic. It was preparation, like he was already 2 moves ahead of whatever came next. She glanced toward the security officers, then toward the travelers now watching. Some were recording, others were whispering, a few were doing both, and she realized this moment wouldn't stay here. It was already leaving, through Wi-Fi, through live streams, through hashtags that hadn't even been typed yet. She opened her mouth to say something, to call someone, but no words came. It was too late. As Malik was walked down the corridor adjacent to boarding gates, his mind cataloged everything. The weight of the cuffs, the sound of children falling silent, the unmistakable burn of judgment, and the cameras. He had seen those lenses before, outside embassies, inside war crime tribunals, during protests in cities where justice was still a whisper rumor. But he'd never imagined this. Not at an airport, not on American soil, not for simply existing in stillness. Do you have anything to say? Briggs barked, his voice lower now, more guarded. Malik looked straight ahead. I have everything to say, he replied quietly. But I've learned not to waste it when no one's listening. Briggs scoffed but didn't respond. Somewhere beneath his bravado, a crack had formed, because Malik wasn't afraid. And fear was what made their job easier. Without it, they had to confront something far more dangerous. A man who knew his rights, and who refused to trade dignity for safety. By the time they reached the security corridor, one of the gate monitors had started replaying a portion of the arrest on a loop, captured by a nearby passenger and uploaded within minutes. The title read, "This is what suspicious looks like now?" And underneath it, comments were already pouring in. He didn't even flinch. Who is this man? They cuffed him for reading? Someone better lose their badge over this. This black man just got profiled hard. The viral storm had begun. But Malik Carrington didn't know it yet. He only knew the feel of cold steel on his skin, the heat of scrutiny, and the knowledge that the racist cop beside him had no idea who he had just handcuffed. That truth, Malik understood, was coming. And when it did, it wouldn't come quietly. It would arrive like a verdict, a reckoning, a reversal no badge could stop. The room smelled like old plastic and fluorescent regret. It was barely 10 feet by 10, with a humming light overhead that buzzed just loud enough to fray nerves. The walls were a dull, institutional gray. No clock, no windows, just the kind of place where the world could forget you existed for as long as it needed to. And in the center of that claustrophobic square sat Malik Carrington, hands cupped behind a metal chair, posture unbroken, eyes steady, breath even. Across from him, Deputy Officer Carter Briggs stood with his arms folded, pacing slowly, a predator without a script. He kept glancing at the tablet in his hand, like it might provide justification for what his gut had already decided. It didn't. Officer Stephen Marsh leaned against the far wall, arms crossed, face unreadable. But Malik noticed the way his left heel kept tapping the floor, as if trying to stomp out a growing flicker of doubt. The silence stretched. Buzz. Tap. Blink. Malik sat in the center of it, all like a stone at the bottom of a still river. He wasn't confused. He wasn't afraid. He was watching, calculating, waiting for the moment when truth would no longer be optional. Briggs finally broke the silence, tossing the tablet onto the metal table with a dull thud. Name. Malik raised a brow. You have my identification, he said, voice low, clipped. And I'm sure it's already been scanned. I asked for your name, Briggs repeated, louder this time. Malik met his gaze. Malik Emmanuel Carrington, born May 3rd, 1962, currently serving as senior legal advisor to the International Commission on Human Rights, attached to the UN Tribunal on Civil Liberties and State Use of Force Guidelines, former chair of the Transatlantic Oversight Council, former advisor to The Hague. Shall I continue? Briggs said nothing. He hadn't expected the words to land like that. Calm, factual, undeniable. He wasn't ready for a black man in handcuffs to speak with the cadence of someone who helped write international law. From the corner, Marsh shifted. Malik turned to him. You haven't said much, he noted. Why is that? Marsh didn't answer, but his eyes lingered on Malik's ID badge, now resting on the table like evidence from a crime that never happened. Briggs cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. We received complaint, he said. Suspicious behavior. You were seen observing people's bags. Pacing. Not engaging. Just watching. Observing is not a crime, Malik replied. Neither is stillness. I was reading. That behavior is only suspicious through a certain lens. Briggs stepped forward, planting both hands on the table. You're getting defensive. I'm being detained without cause, Malik countered. That's not defensive. That's precise. Briggs stared at him, searching for something. Weakness, arrogance, anything that would let him slap a label on Malik and feel justified in how this had unfolded. But all he saw was clarity, and that scared him more than resistance ever could. "We'll review footage," he muttered. "I encourage it," Malik said. "Start at 6:55 a.m. I arrived. I cleared TSA. My boarding pass was scanned at gate B29. I sat. I read. I highlighted a legal briefing from a Ukraine tribunal. I didn't move for over 30 minutes. And then you arrived." Briggs opened his mouth, but paused. The facts were too neat. The timeline too composed. The man too composed. This wasn't supposed to be complicated. This was supposed to be simple. A report comes in. A man doesn't belong. You remove the problem. You keep the order. That was the script. But Malik Carrington had walked into a scene with an entirely different genre, and now the entire production was falling apart. In the hall just outside the room, a young officer handed Marsh a file. Results from the ID scan. Malik's UN status was confirmed. His credentials lined up. His travel history matched. There were 0 flags. 0 inconsistencies. Marsh stared at the file for a long moment. Then, slowly, he opened the door and stepped back inside. "Sir," he said to Briggs, voice low, "his ID checks out. All of it." Briggs didn't look at the folder. Didn't move. "We'll verify that through official channels," he said, stubborn. Malik looked from one man to the other, then placed his cuffed hands on the table. Calmly but deliberately, "I suggest you do it quickly," he said, "because right now, every second you hold me here is another violation." Briggs scoffed. "This isn't some international incident." "It is now," Malik said softly. "You just don't know it yet." Outside the room, the video of Malik's arrest had crossed 50,000 views. A caption had been added. "Black man handcuffed at airport for reading." Hashtags followed. Hashtag airport gate B29. Hashtag racist cop. Hashtag stillness is not a sin. Hashtag Malik Carrington. Inside, the tension was reaching a boiling point. But Malik never raised his voice. He didn't need to. He sat in that chair like it was a courtroom bench. And Carter Briggs, whether he realized it or not, was now the one being cross-examined. "I was taught," Malik said at last, "that silence is often louder than outrage, that the way you hold yourself in the middle of injustice can define what comes after." Briggs sneered. "And what comes after this?" Malik didn't blink. Accountability. The word rang out, unshakable, undeniable. And in that moment, the silence wasn't empty. It was evidence. The silence in the interrogation room no longer felt firm. It felt brittle. Officer Stephen Marsh stood near the wall, arms folded across his chest. Trying to pretend the hum of the overhead lights was what made him uncomfortable. But it wasn't the lights. It was a man sitting across the table, Malik Carrington, whose presence filled the room with something heavier than anger. Truth. The kind of truth Marsh had spent his entire career trying not to look at too closely. Deputy Officer Carter Briggs was still doing most of the talking, if you could call it that. He paced now, muttering about protocol and due process, his confidence eroding with every minute that passed. His tone was louder, sharper, but also less certain, like a man raising his voice to drown out his own self-doubt. "Your ID still doesn't mean you weren't acting suspiciously," Briggs barked. Malik didn't move. "Suspicion," he said calmly, "is not a substitute for evidence, and discomfort is not a crime." Briggs turned to Marsh as if for backup. "You saw him. He was just sitting there, watching people." Marsh didn't answer right away. His eyes had been on Malik this whole time, but not with the cold detachment he had shown earlier. No, this was different. He was watching closely now, like he was trying to see something he'd missed before. And he had, because Malik wasn't just composed. He wasn't just intelligent. He wasn't just innocent. He was prepared in a way that came not from privilege, but from necessity. Marsh recognized it now, the subtle armor of a man who'd lived his whole life in spaces that questioned his presence, and still chose to walk into them anyway. Outside the room, the numbers were climbing. The video had passed 100,000 views. A new title had emerged on Twitter. This black man was cuffed for sitting quietly at an airport gate. Then the truth came out. The comment section had turned into a live courtroom. "This is Profiling 101. Look at his body language. Calm. No resistance. They didn't even ask him anything before cuffing him. This could have been my dad, my brother, me. At least 3 major journalists had tagged Logan Airport's official account. A Boston City Councilwoman had retweeted the clip with the words, "Unacceptable. We need answers." But inside the room, Briggs remained in denial. "Your name doesn't change the facts," he said, gripping the edge of the table. "We had a report. We had a right to investigate." Malik's eyes flicked to Marsh. He spoke slowly. "No, you had an obligation to verify." Marsh's throat tightened because he hadn't. He hadn't asked who Malik was. Hadn't asked what the report actually contained. Hadn't even looked for camera footage before cuffing a man who could quote the Geneva Conventions by heart. He just followed. Like always, Briggs turned back toward Marsh. "Can we get someone from TSA in here? Maybe a supervisor?" Marsh didn't respond, because something inside him had just fractured, and it started with a memory. 12 years ago, he'd pulled over a black teenager in a hoodie for a busted taillight. The kid had his hands out the window before Marsh even got to the door. When Marsh told him he wasn't under arrest, the kid almost cried, not from relief, but from expectation. Because somewhere along the way, Marsh had stopped being someone who asked questions. He had become someone who followed commands, responded to feelings, whispered fears dressed up as reports. Until today. Until Malik Carrington. "Run the cameras," Marsh said suddenly. Briggs turned. "What?" "I said check the terminal feed," Marsh repeated. "We got access to the Concourse security footage. If he was casing luggage or acting erratically, it'll be there." Briggs scowled. "You don't believe me?" Marsh met his eyes for the first time. "I believe we're supposed to find out the truth, not confirm a feeling." That landed like a slap across the badge. Briggs looked like he might argue, but didn't. Instead, he left the room, muttering under his breath. Malik watched him go, then looked back at Marsh. "You didn't ask," he said, back at the gate. "You didn't ask me who I was." Marsh sat down slowly, across from him now. "No, I didn't." A pause. "Why not?" Marsh stared at the table for a long moment. Then he said the one thing Malik had been waiting for, but never expected to hear. "Because I assumed." There it was. The crack. Not in the system. Not yet, but in the man. And from that crack, something rare slipped into the air. Accountability. Malik nodded once. "Then ask me now." Marsh took a deep breath. "Who are you?" Malik spoke without pause, without ego. "Malik Emmanuel Carrington, legal advisor, former Federal Civil Liberties Commissioner. I've written protocols on state-level oversight for airport detentions in 4 countries. And today, I was handcuffed in my own country, without cause, without explanation, and without anyone asking me a single question." Marsh swallowed hard. Then he stood and walked out of the room without a word. In the operations hub down the hall, Briggs was already watching the footage. There it was, Malik sitting, still, silent, reading. 37 minutes. No circling. No talking to strangers. No watching bags. Just existing. Briggs's jaw tightened. He turned toward Marsh as he entered the room. "This is clean," Marsh said, pointing at the screen. He didn't do anything wrong. Briggs said nothing, because deep down he knew the damage had already been done, and the world was watching. It started with a phone, then another, then 10 more. By the time Malik Carrington had been led down the side corridor of Logan Airport, his hands cuffed but his spine straight, at least 5 passengers had captured the entire incident from different angles. The footage was raw. No narration, no edits, no flashy cuts. Just the unmistakable image of a black man at an airport gate being arrested for nothing. No yelling. No resisting. No outburst. Just quiet. And that was the part no one could stop watching. The silence. By 9:42 a.m., less than 20 minutes after Malik had disappeared behind the double doors of the security annex, a clip titled, "He just sat there, black man handcuffed at airport gate for being too quiet," had been posted on TikTok by a college freshman on her way to spring break in Miami. She hadn't meant to go viral. She just knew what she saw wasn't right. "I was 2 rows away," her caption read. "He didn't do a thing. He was just reading." They cuffed it without even asking questions. By 10:07 a.m., the video had passed 300,000 views. By 10:30, it had crossed 1 million. It spread across Reddit, Twitter, Instagram Reels, WhatsApp, Telegram, passed from hand to hand like digital fire, fueled not by rage but by disbelief. Because it wasn't a loud injustice that shook people. It was a stillness. The way Malik's silence exposed everything. A man handcuffed not because of what he did, but because of what he didn't do. He didn't explain himself. He didn't perform his innocence. He didn't panic. And that terrified the system more than anger ever could. In a newsroom across the city, journalist Rhea Stanton stared at her laptop screen, fists clenched. She'd covered police overreach. She'd written pieces on surveillance discrimination. But there was something about this, about how normal it looked, that made her skin crawl. She replayed the moment Malik raised his hands and let them cuff him. No struggle, no shout, just that unwavering look on his face, like he was watching the entire machine crumble beneath its own weight. By 11 a.m., Rhea's editorial was live. Stillness is a threat. The black man who made silence go viral. In the airport lounge above gate B29, the atmosphere had shifted. Passengers had stopped scrolling through travel deals and weather updates. Now, they were refreshing Twitter, reading comments, whispering, "That's the guy, right? Same coat, same beard. Oh my God, he was just reading. Someone's gonna lose their job over this." And sitting near the window, wrapped in her designer scarf, her phone clenched in a whitening hand, Lydia Whitmore felt the temperature around her drop by 10 degrees. She hadn't moved since Briggs took Malik away. She hadn't needed to. She had done what she always did, trusted her instinct, leaned on the system she'd always relied on to make discomfort disappear. But now, the weight of the moment was coming back to her, pixel by pixel. A text from a friend blinked onto her screen. "This you?" Attached, a zoomed-in freeze frame. Malik in cuffs. And in the background, her face, slightly turned, just visible. By 11:22 a.m., someone had found her name. By 11:35, her LinkedIn was flooded with 1-star reviews. By noon, her employer had placed her on leave. The whisper that started everything had become a digital hurricane, and now it had found its source. Back in the operations room, the airport's public relations officer was sweating through his suit jacket. On the large monitor behind him, a live social tracker map pulsed red and orange with activity spikes. "Viral in all 5 boroughs," he muttered. "Seattle's lighting up. Atlanta, Chicago, even Brussels." Agent Elias Monroe, who had arrived minutes earlier from the Department of International Oversight, stood unmoving as he reviewed the situation. His badge glinted under the fluorescent lights. His expression didn't change, but his presence alone had shifted the gravity of the room. "You've detained a man who trains foreign governments on civil liberties," Monroe said flatly. The PR rep looked like he might pass out. "And now," Monroe continued, "you've made him a symbol." In the interrogation room, Malik still sat upright. The cuffs had been removed, finally, but he hadn't spoken for the last 5 minutes. Not out of fatigue, not out of surrender, but because silence was still his sharpest weapon. Officer Marsh sat across from him, his notepad untouched, his eyes flicking between Malik and the door, unsure whether to apologize or ask for forgiveness. He didn't understand how this man could be so composed. "You knew this would go public," Marsh said at last. Malik tilted his head. "No," he replied. "I knew it could. That's different." Marsh nodded, then whispered like it physically hurt. "I'm sorry." Malik didn't nod back. Instead, he said, "What you do after this matters more." By 12:47 p.m., a breaking news banner appeared across national television. Black legal advisor detained at airport without cause. Footage goes viral. The panelists were already debating it. What threat does a man pose when he's simply reading? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing? What assumptions are baked into this kind of policing What does it say when silence becomes probable cause? At the bottom of the screen, Malik's name now scrolled in bold. Malik E. Carrington, human rights attorney on legal advisor. A black man, in a gray coat. No shouting, no struggle, just quiet. And it was changing everything. At 1:03 p.m., a law student in New York updated her Twitter bio. Studying law so no one ever cuffs my father for being calm at an airport. Hashtag Malik Carrington. At 1:10, a muralist in Chicago began sketching the outline of a man in cuffs, shoulders square, head held high. The caption below it would read, "Stillness is not a crime." Back in the airport, as Malik was escorted, this time without cuffs, through the terminal, he passed the same coffee kiosk, the same gate, the same floor tiles. But everything had changed. He walked past a woman crying quietly into her scarf, past teenagers pretending not to stare, past a young black child gripping his mother's hand, eyes wide with something between awe and fear. And still, Malik said nothing, because the world had already started speaking for him. The door opened without warning. It didn't creak. It didn't slam. It just opened, smooth, silent, decisive. Deputy Officer Carter Briggs turned around instinctively, irritation already rising in his throat. He wasn't in the mood for more interruptions. Not when the press was circling. Not when a million strangers online were dissecting every second of a video he barely remembered being in. But this wasn't a janitor or another security officer. This man wore a charcoal black overcoat. No airport badge. No name tag. Just a small silver crest clipped neatly to his inner lapel. A federal emblem not everyone would recognize, but the ones who mattered did. He moved like someone used to walking into rooms and immediately being the highest authority present. Behind him, two more individuals in dark suits stood silently, their expressions unreadable, their eyes scanning everything. The man didn't wait to be greeted. "I'm Agent Elias Monroe," he said coolly, "Office of International Legal Oversight." Briggs blinked. This is a local matter." "No," Monroe said, stepping fully into the room. "It's not." He laid a leather folder onto the metal table where Malik Carrington had sat just an hour earlier, hands cuffed, dignity intact. "You're currently holding a United Nations affiliated legal advisor. You detained him without verified probable cause, without jurisdiction, and in direct violation of international protocol concerning diplomatic civilian consultants." Briggs scoffed. He didn't identify himself until after. "Yes, he did." Monroe cut in. "It's on the footage, which, by the way, we've already reviewed. So have two independent legal observers, the U.S. consul in Brussels and the Hague's Emergency Oversight Desk." Briggs opened his mouth again. Monroe didn't let him speak. "You handcuffed a man who writes the very policy documents we use to train airport security officials. He's lectured on wrongful detention across 5 continents. He's testified before parliaments. He narrowed his gaze, and you didn't even ask his name." Silence. Marsh, standing against the wall, swallowed hard. Monroe turned toward him. "You're Officer Marsh?" "Yes, sir." "Were you the arresting officer?" Marsh hesitated. "No, sir. I was present, but..." Deputy Briggs initiated the detainment. Monroe nodded once, slowly. "Thank you. You'll be giving a full statement later. For now, step outside." Marsh left without protest. Briggs looked like he wanted to argue, but couldn't find the ground to stand on. Monroe stepped closer. "Mr. Carrington is currently being escorted under protective protocol to a secured terminal lounge. He is unharmed, thanks in no part to you, and he has requested full documentation of today's incident, including officer badge numbers, internal justification logs, and access to any and all communications referencing his detainment." Briggs squared his shoulders. "I followed procedure." "No," Monroe replied coldly. "You followed bias. You followed assumption. And you followed a whisper from a passenger who didn't even know his name." He stepped back, voice quiet but cutting. "You know what happens next, Officer Briggs?" Briggs said nothing. "You'll be contacted by Internal Affairs. I suggest you retain counsel." Meanwhile, across the terminal, Malik Carrington sat in a small executive lounge, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside him. His overcoat hung neatly over the chair, his wrists now free. But the impressions of the cuffs still lingered as faint red lines etched into his skin. They didn't hurt. They didn't need to. They were reminders. Two legal representatives from the airport's internal compliance board stood nearby, their faces carefully neutral. But Malik knew they were watching him the way people watch a storm cloud on the edge of the sky, uncertain whether to brace for thunder or pray for silence. He didn't offer either. Instead, when Agent Monroe entered the room, Malik simply nodded. "Sir," Monroe said, "we've confirmed the internal breach. Detainment protocol was violated. You are clear to file for grievance, public disclosure, and formal diplomatic escalation under Section 7B of the UN Civil Liberties Accord." Malik raised an eyebrow. "That sounds very official." "It is. But is it accountability?" Monroe paused. "That part," he admitted, "is up to you." Malik stood slowly, adjusting his sleeves. "I don't want revenge," he said. "I want records. I want names. I want to know who signed off, who ignored red flags, and who stayed silent. And I want it public." Monroe nodded. "You'll have it." Malik's voice dropped lower. "Then I'll decide how loud I need to be." Back outside the lounge, the media had descended like vultures. News vans screeched the curbs. Microphones popped up like weeds. A wall of cameras pointed at a single man walking to the gate, no longer in cuffs, no longer unknown. Just a black man, walking, dignified, still, and this time, the silence didn't belong to him. It belonged to the airport. It belonged to Carter Briggs, standing in a break room, watching the news cycle spin his face across every screen. It belonged to Lydia Whitmore, sitting in a private corner of the terminal, now being followed by whispers louder than the one she had started. And it belonged to a country unwilling to admit how often this story had played out, without cameras, without agents, without anyone ever being held to account. At 3:12 p.m., Malik exited to a side door and paused for a single photo, one frame, requested by Agent Monroe for formal records. In the photo, Malik stands tall, flanked by two legal escorts, the airport in soft blur behind him. His expression? Still, not triumphant, not angry, just focused. The caption, later picked up by news outlets worldwide, read, "The man they cuffed without question walked away without breaking, but with the world watching." And far above Gate B29, the monitors continued to cycle through flight updates, destination gates, and status changes. But the departure no one could ignore had already happened. A black man's silence had left the room and turned into something that could no longer be detained. The room was quiet, not because no one had anything to say, but because no one knew how to say it. Malik Carrington stood at the head of the long glass conference table inside the Internal Affairs office of Logan Airport. His posture was calm, upright, controlled, but the kind of calm that unnerved people. Not passive, not subdued, just deliberate. The kind of composure that made people realize they were being watched by someone who saw through them. Seated along the table were 6 individuals. 2 internal affairs investigators, a federal transit liaison, a legal observer from UN, and 2 members of Logan Airport's executive administration. All of them had copies of the preliminary report in front of them. None had dared to look Malik directly in the eye, at least not yet. Malik didn't need to slam fists or raise his voice. He had already made the world listen without speaking. Now, he would make them remember. "I'm not here for apologies," Malik began, voice low but firm. "I don't want sympathy. And I'm not interested in optics." One of the executives flinched slightly. "I want documentation," Malik continued. "Every log, every timestamp. The internal memo that broadcast a suspicious mail at Gate B29. The source report. The radio call logs. The footage. And I want them all preserved." "You'll receive them," replied the federal liaison, a woman in her late 50s, "under legal protocol." "I don't want them under legal protocol," Malik said, looking directly at her. "I want them under ethical obligation." The room felt even quieter. Malik stepped away from the table and moved toward the window, floor-to-ceiling glass overlooking the runways, where planes took off in smooth ascension, unaware of the turbulence inside this room. He didn't look at the planes. He looked at the reflection of those sitting behind him. "You know," he said slowly, "I've testified before judges who sentenced war criminals. I've helped draft frameworks to prevent state abuse. I've trained officers in Eastern Europe on what it means to serve without bias." He turned around. "But not once did I ever imagine I'd have to defend myself against my own country. Not in an airport. Not because I sat quietly. Not because someone felt off about my existence." One of the investigators cleared his throat. "Mr. Carrington, we understand the severity of—" "No, you don't," Malik said calmly, cutting him off. "You understand the visibility of it. You understand the PR nightmare. But you don't understand the pattern." He walked back to the table, placed his hands gently on its edge. This wasn't a mistake. It was a process, one that worked exactly as it was designed to, until a camera forced it to pause. The UN observer, seated closest to him, finally spoke. "Mr. Carrington, would you be willing to provide a formal statement for the Geneva Council?" Malik nodded. "I already have. But this isn't about Geneva. This is about here. Now." He opened the slim black folder he had brought with him. Inside were 6 copies of printed proposal, each one clipped neatly color-coded and bearing a title in bold. "The Carrington Framework for Civil Rights Oversight in Transit Spaces." He began handing them out one by one. "The system isn't broken," he said. "It's functioning exactly as designed. What we need is an apology or adjustment. We need disruption. Structural, unapologetic, enforced by law and lived in practice." The administrator, a gray-haired man who had remained silent until now, took a glance at the first page. "This is a federal policy?" "No," Malik replied. "It's a blueprint, one that includes real-time escalation accountability, independent citizen review panels, public access dashboards, and mandatory anti-bias certification every 12 months for all transit-based law enforcement." He paused. "And in case you're wondering, yes, I wrote it on the flight home." They stared, because no one had expected this. Not from the man in the cuffs. Not from the stillness at gate B29. Not from someone who was supposed to leave quietly. Meanwhile, on the other side of the airport, Officer Carter Briggs sat alone in a debriefing room. He hadn't spoken since being relieved of duty that morning. The moment the handcuffs had been removed from Malik's wrists, something inside Briggs had snapped. Not like guilt, something worse. Recognition. He didn't know who Malik Carrington was, and he hadn't cared. He hadn't even asked. That realization now sat like a stone in his stomach, too heavy to move and too real to ignore. When an internal affairs representative entered the room, Briggs looked up with tired eyes. "Is he filing charges?" he asked. The officer paused. "He's not filing revenge. He's filing policy." Briggs blinked. "What?" "He's rewriting the rules," the rep said, placing a single-page memo in front of him. "You're going to be one of the case studies." Briggs lowered his gaze, and for the first time, he didn't argue. Back in the conference room, Malik had finished speaking. He didn't ask for consensus. He didn't wait for applause. He simply closed his folder and said, "What happened at that gate wasn't about me. It was about what happens to people like me when no one's watching." He reached for his coat, draped it over one arm, and turned to leave. At the door, the UN observer asked softly, "Mr. Carrington, is there anything else you want?" Malik paused, then turned back, his tone deliberate. "I want this written down," he said. "All of it. Every action. Every silence. Every assumption. Because if we don't document what broke, we won't know where to begin the repair." The room held its breath. Then Malik walked out, head high, step steady. And though no chains bound him now, every step echoed like a verdict. Not against him, but against the system that had dared to put him on trial for his quiet. The press called it a review. The department called it internal proceedings. But in truth, it felt like an execution. Not of a man, but of an illusion. The illusion that authority without accountability could survive the light. Officer Carter Briggs sat stiff in a plain blue suit, stripped his badge and uniform, hands clasped tightly together as if he could still hold on to something. dignity, maybe, or just a memory of who he was before the world learned his name. Across from him sat a panel of 5. Federal, civilian, UN legal. Not one of them looked interested in hearing excuses. "We're here to discuss your role in the unlawful detainment of Mr. Malik Carrington," began Chief Investigator Lena Corwin, her tone clipped like the ticking of a courtroom clock. "Please confirm. Did you verify Mr. Carrington's identity before placing him in handcuffs?" Briggs cleared his throat. "I received a complaint." "That's not what I asked," she said flatly. Briggs hesitated. "No, I didn't verify." "And why not?" A long pause. He could have said he was rushed. He could have said the report was urgent. He could have said anything. But all that would do now was dig the hole deeper. "Because I didn't think I had to." The room went still. No one gasped. No one flinched. But the truth landed all the same. Down the hall, Officer Stephen Marsh sat in a separate interview room, a styrofoam cup of untouched coffee in front of him. He'd been cooperative, candid, even. And he looked like a man carrying the weight of a truth he could no longer unknow. "I didn't initiate the detainment," he told the internal review agent. "But I didn't stop it either. I had access to tools, camera footage, ID checks. I didn't use them." "Why?" "Because the whisper felt louder than the facts." The agent scribbled a note. "Do you regret it?" "Yes," Marsh said. "Every part of it." And this time, he didn't flinch when he said it. The consequences came quickly. Briggs was placed on immediate suspension without pay, pending a full federal disciplinary hearing. Marsh was reassigned to non-field duties, with mandatory retraining under an independent civilian oversight panel. But neither of them had seen the full impact. Not yet, because Malik Carrington hadn't just exposed them. He had exposed a rot they were trained inside. And now the world wanted names. 3 days later, a press conference was held outside Logan Airport. No podium, no flags, just Malik and the world. Dozens of microphones stretched toward him. Cameras snapped like electric insects. Reporters called out questions, shouted names, tried to provoke emotion. But Malik, dressed in a dark gray suit and open collared shirt, held his calm the way others held weapons. When he finally spoke, his voice was clear and steady. "I was detained without cause. Not because I was dangerous. Not because I was uncooperative. But because I was quiet. Because I was black. Because someone whispered a suspicion, and the system leaned in without question." He let the words breathe. "I am not the first. And unless the system changes, I won't be the last." One reporter asked, "What do you want to happen to the officers involved?" Malik looked directly into the camera. "I don't want them fired. I want them educated. I want them deprogrammed. And I want the system that made them possible dismantled." He held up a thin blue folder. "This is the beginning," he said. "The Carrington Initiative. Oversight, transparency, accountability." A pause, and silence, when youth ignore injustice, will never be tolerated again. That night, an internal email from Logan Airport's Board of Governors leaked to the press. The subject line read, "We cannot afford another Malik Carrington." Attached was a 22-page policy overhaul proposal based on Malik's framework. Within 48 hours, the following measures were enacted. All passenger complaint reports must now be corroborated by digital surveillance before officer action is permitted. Every field officer must complete quarterly civil rights certification. All detainments are to be reviewed in real time by an independent civilian monitor. Any detainment made without full verification will result in automatic suspension. For the first time in the airport's history, a civilian advisory panel would hold veto power over field escalation. The system was beginning to change, not because it wanted to, but because it had no choice. In the privacy of his home, Carter Briggs watched the news unfold like a slow-motion implosion. Malik Carrington's face was everywhere, on screens, in headlines, in classrooms, in city council sessions. And not once did he appear bitter. Not once did he yell. He simply stood. And now, Briggs's entire legacy had unraveled because of a man who refused to flinch. His phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. When you cuffed him, you weren't silencing a man. You were lighting a match. Briggs didn't reply, because deep down he knew it was true, and he also knew who would write the rules next. Across the city, in a quiet office flooded with natural light, Malik reviewed letters from young lawyers, civil rights advocates, and students. They didn't want revenge. They wanted blueprints. He picked up one envelope. The return address read, Watson High School, Criminal Justice Club. Inside, a handwritten note read, You made us believe we could stand for something, without shouting, without violence. Thank you for reminding us that silence can scream. Malik smiled softly, not because he won, but because someone heard. Finally, the office wasn't grand. It was a modest space on the 6th floor of a red brick building tucked between a bookstore and a church in downtown Boston. The elevator smelled faintly of old carpet and printer ink. The hallway buzzed with the kind of energy only new ideas could generate, raw, uncertain, and full of fire. This was not a courtroom, not a boardroom, not the United Nations. But this is where history would begin. Malik Carrington stood in front of a whiteboard smeared with dry erase markers, blue, red, black. Every color bleeding into the outline of something much larger than himself. Behind him, a team of 7 legal minds, civil rights activists, data scientists, and policy writers gathered around folding tables, laptops open, coffee growing cold beside highlighted drafts. Above the door, a simple vinyl banner fluttered slightly from the open window. The Carrington Center for Civil Liberties. Not a brand, a promise. Run me through it again, Malik said, marker in hand. The youngest member of the team, Eva Lee, a policy graduate barely out of MIT, stood, her voice sure. The Carrington Initiative is structured around 4 non-negotiables, she said. 1. Real-time verification of any detainment request. No more gut feeling, stops. 2. Civilian oversight boards with veto power. 3. Mandatory recertification for all transit enforcement officers, quarterly, not annually. And 4. Public dashboards for transparency. Accessible complaint tracking within 30 days, visible to the public. She paused. And we just finished integrating AI-scrubbed, anonymized data for patterns of bias. If a single officer shows disproportionate stops based on race, gender, or perceived behavior, automatic flag. Malik nodded. Enforcement. Eva smiled. Every officer signs a new oath. Breach it once, mandatory review. Breach it twice, you're done. No one in the room clapped. They didn't need to. This wasn't applause territory. It was accountability territory. Across town, media outlets were already running headlines. Carrington proposes boldest transit reform in U.S. history. From cuffs to council, one man's plan to redesign justice. The airport gate that sparked a national oversight movement. But Malik wasn't interested in headlines. He was interested in infrastructure, because the system that tried to reduce him to a threat wasn't a single officer. It wasn't a whisper. It wasn't even one airport. It was a network, one that needed dismantling, brick by brick, policy by policy. At 2:15 p.m., Malik held a press roundtable, not at City Hall, not on Capitol Hill, but in the converted conference room of the Carrington Center itself. No suits, no podiums, just people and truth. This is not about me, he said, voice even. This is about the people who never had their name printed, who were stopped, searched, shamed, silenced, and forgotten. He held up a worn leather notebook, faded, creased. In here, he said, are 147 stories, all submitted in the last 7 days, all from people wrongfully detained in transit spaces across the country. He paused. Most of them are black, some Muslim, some transgender, all invisible to the system until now. A journalist from the Boston Globe asked, "Do you think you'll get federal traction?" Malik didn't hesitate. "I don't think. I know." He pointed toward the monitor behind him, displaying the logos of 5 major airports already requesting copies of the Carrington Protocols. And we're just getting started. That night, after the building emptied and the white boards were wiped clean, Malik sat alone at his desk. The city hummed beyond the window. Distant sirens, the rustle of wind, the occasional late-night bus groaning down Tremont Street. He opened his inbox. 57 new emails. Some were from lawmakers, some from university deans. One from a 14-year-old girl in Nebraska who had written, "My dad cried watching your video. I've never seen him cry before. He said your silence made him feel seen." Malik reread it twice, then pressed his palms together, as if in silent prayer. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't wanted fame. He'd only wanted a quiet flight. But when the system tried to reduce him to an incident, he gave them a framework. When they reached for handcuffs, he offered blueprints. When they demanded compliance, he wrote policy. Because he understood something that few ever had the patience to articulate. Dignity was not a privilege. It was a right. And rights had to be protected, not by outrage alone, but by law. At midnight, the Carrington Center's site went live. The homepage was simple, just one image. Malik, standing alone outside gate B29, back straight, expression calm. No handcuffs, no spotlight, just stillness. Beneath the image, 3 words scrolled slowly across the screen. "We watch now." Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., a senator refreshed her email. Subject line, "The Carrington Initiative draft attached." She clicked open the file. On the first page, a quote was written in small font. "We can't fix what we won't document. We can't restore trust in silence. But we can rebuild a system loud enough to protect it." She smiled and hit forward. It didn't look like a monument. There were no statues, no plaques, no flags waving solemnly in the wind. Just a quiet metal bench near gate B29, beneath a tall window that faced the tarmac. The sunlight poured through that glass every morning, casting long shadows that stretched across the polished floor tiles like silent witnesses. Passengers walked by without noticing, but the ones who knew stopped, not because of the bench, but because of what happened right there, where a black man once sat, reading, waiting, breathing, and where the world finally saw what happens when silence is mistaken for threat, and truth refuses to kneel. 6 months had passed since that morning, when Malik Carrington was handcuffed at the airport gate for being too calm. 6 months since the video shattered the internet, since the headlines erupted, since the whisper of one woman became a wildfire of reform. But Malik, he never chased the spotlight. He didn't want to become a symbol. He wanted to build a system that would outlast outrage. And he had. On a rainy Tuesday in October, Malik returned to Logan Airport, not as a passenger, but as a keynote speaker. The terminal was hosting a first-of-its-kind global summit on civil liberties in transit enforcement. The press called it a milestone. Malik called it a beginning. He arrived early, quietly, no entourage, no flashbulbs, just a navy coat, a notebook, and a mind that refused to forget what had been done and what could still be undone. He passed gate B29 without a pause. But as he walked by, a woman stopped him, older, African-American, traveling alone, her eyes wide with recognition. "Are you?" she started. Malik smiled gently. "I'm him." She swallowed hard. "I watch what they did to you. I show that video to my grandsons. I tell them, this is how you rise without raising your voice." Malik nodded. The gratitude etched into his silence. "You changed something," she whispered. "No," he replied. "We changed it because we watched, and we didn't look away." Inside the conference hall, the atmosphere was electric. Delegates from 21 countries, representatives from TSA, Interpol, Amnesty International, and the UN, panels on racial bias training, AI-driven bias flagging, civilian oversight deployment across airports. At the center of it all, the Carrington Initiative, once a single-page concept written mid-flight, now a global policy prototype. And the man behind it? Calm, centered, listening more than speaking. But when he did speak, the room leaned in. There was a time when being silent made you invisible. Malik said from the stage, "Now, silence can be your defense, your strength, because in a world addicted to noise, stillness can shake the floor." Applause, sustained, earnest, not just for words, but for the man who earned the right to say them. Later that evening, Malik sat in a quiet lounge far from the cameras, watching flights land and depart, watching strangers hustle with luggage and dreams. And then his phone buzzed. A message from someone named Tyrese Walker, a public defender from Atlanta. Saw you speak. Just filed my first complaint under the Carrington protocol. Officer held my client in the terminal for no reason. They released him after 5 minutes. No fight, just the system working. Thank you, Mr. Carrington. You gave us the rules we didn't know we were allowed to write. Malik stared at the message for a moment, then tucked the phone away, because that was the point. Not to be remembered, but to make sure no one was forgotten again. Across the country, things were changing. LAX had implemented real-time detainment verification. JFK had created its first public oversight dashboard. Chicago Midway had fired 5 officers for repeat violations. And in Europe, Frankfurt and Amsterdam were piloting Carrington-aligned protocols. None of these things made the news anymore, because the news had moved on. But Malik hadn't. He was busy, building, training, teaching. Everywhere he went, he told the story of Gate B29, not with rage, but with resolve. He didn't call it trauma. He called it a fractured line in the foundation of assumed power. And he invited others not to mourn it, but to rebuild it. Back at Logan, a teenage boy stood silently in front of the bench by Gate B29. He wore a hoodie, earbuds in, a backpack slung low over one shoulder. His mother watched from a few feet away, unsure whether to speak. Finally, he turned to her and asked, "This is where they arrested that man, right?" She nodded. "Why?" She struggled for words. Then, softly, because he was a black man, and he didn't flinch. The boy stared down at the floor, then sat quietly on the bench, not afraid, not angry, just still. And for the first time, his mother didn't tell him to keep moving, because she knew someone had made that stillness possible. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the terminal lights flickered to life, Malik Carrington boarded a flight to Geneva. A summit on data transparency and civil liberty accountability awaited. But as he settled into his seat, aisle 14C, he didn't reach for a speech. He opened a book. No camera, no crowd, just a black man, reading, calm, safe, and this time, nobody moved to stop him. If this story moved you, even just a little, don't let it stop here. Subscribe to our channel to keep these voices alive. Like this video if you believe silence should never be punished. Share it with someone who needs to know the power of quiet resistance. Because the next story we tell might be the one that finally changes everything. And it starts with you.